Hello, hello! I have snow! I've been kicking back, drinking kombucha, living my best life, and so I thought, why not? Let's go ahead and talk about a little sedition. So today we're going to be looking at Abrams v. United States, a case out of the early 20th century. And this particular discussion is going to revolve around the First Amendment. As I'm sure most of you know, there was a little thing called the First World War, and the United States was largely neutral, though we did have a rather wonderful habit of backdoor shipping weapons and other supplies to the Allied powers prior to our entry in 1918. You're also probably aware that we have in our Constitution the First Amendment, which does things like protects speech against government intervention, the ability to assemble, the ability to practice your religion, etc., etc., etc. But in the lead up into the First World War, the United States government passed something called the Espionage Act, and then they amended it the following year in 1918 with the Sedition Act. Now, the two work together, they can't really be separated. So from here on out, I'm just going to be talking about the Espionage Act. Now, this rather horse-pucky piece of legislation forbade the use of things like disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the United States government, the flag, the armed forces, and then anything else really that would cause an individual to hold the American government or its institutions with contempt. It's an absurdly broad set of wording, but that's kind of the point. And what ended up happening is there weren't a ton of convictions under this particular law, thank goodness. But if you were convicted, you were likely sentenced anywhere from 5 to 20 years in prison. So while the government didn't necessarily bother using it that often, when they did, they decided to smack you in the face with a hammer. Though if it makes anyone feel better, after the war and they started repealing the sedition portions and chunks of the Espionage Act itself, they did end up commuting or pardoning a bunch of individuals that had been convicted under this particular act, though not everybody. There's also another piece of historical context that's going to be necessary for this particular discussion to make a lot of sense. As World War I was meandering its way through the timeline, right, the Russians were part of the war. Only they then had their own civil war, in effect, where the Bolshevik uprising overthrew the Tsar. He ends up dead. You end up with the communist government of what becomes the USSR. But in and amongst all of that fighting and the revolutionizing, there were factions within the Russian population. You had the Reds, the communists, and then the whites who were loyalists. Now, what a lot of people don't seem to remember is that the United States government actually sent soldiers to Russia during the Russian Revolution to fight on behalf of the Tsar. So we joined the white side of the particular fight, and that ends up being necessary to understand when you look at the facts of this particular case. Now, the defendants in this particular case, there were a couple of them, were accused of violating the Espionage Act by distributing pamphlets in New York City and other leaflets, and they were doing it in English and Yiddish, and the court goes to actually a fair bit of discussion and time to let you know that these individuals that are being tried are all Russian, intelligent with considerable amounts of schooling, and while they had lived within the United States for several years, they'd never gone through the process to actually become citizens. And in fact, several of them had gone to great pains to indicate that they had no interest in the United States government or citizenship at all. In fact, they were rebels, revolutionaries, and one of them in particular had called the United States capitalistic and said that he was a socialist and that he had no approval or love for capitalism at all. Now, the language in these leaflets, these pamphlets that got them into trouble, is actually well described in the case, and I would go to it. The citation is down below for you, and take a look, because there's a fair bit of back and forth in there. But to give you sort of an idea of what it is that we're talking about, some of the pamphlets included things like the hypocrisy of the United States and her allies, denouncing then President Wilson as a hypocrite and a coward because he was sending troops into Russia to fight on behalf of the Tsar. They were also making pro-Russian revolutionary statements, attacking capitalism itself, etc., etc. And while normally, say today, these kinds of statements would be protected under the First Amendment, because of the language in this Espionage Act, they were being deemed illegal. Now, one of the charges for these individuals was conspiracy, and the reason they were able to bring it is they found a headquarters for these people, and when the police went in and searched this particular headquarters, they found the leaflets with a bunch of different people's names on them. These individuals did take responsibility for that language, and because you now have a cluster of people acting in concert toward a particular goal, which at the time was illegal, wham bam, thank you ma'am, now we have conspiracy. Now, at their initial trial, they quite rightly raised First Amendment arguments saying that their speech was protected, that the Espionage Act itself is illegal because it contravenes the First Amendment. But obviously, since this got to the Supreme Court and we're talking about it, those arguments were overturned, they were overruled, and they were convicted. The court initially took those arguments and basically just slapped them down one after another, citing a series of previous cases, including Schenck v. United States. Now, I'm not going to go into them here, but again, the citation is down below, so go ahead and just take a look at them if you're interested in the history of the arguments. But there's also a small procedural quirk in this particular case. Now, the appeal that got them to the Supreme Court was basically saying that there's no substantial evidence in the record to support the judgment of guilty that the jury brought against these individuals, and that when they made a motion for something called a directed verdict, it was erroneously denied. Now, a directed verdict is basically where a judge says no reasonable person could have found you guilty even though the jury just did, so I'm going to direct a verdict contrary to the jury. It's basically there to protect you against a malicious jury. So then we get to the Supreme Court, and they start out their discussion on a procedural footing, which is appropriate given the nature of the appeal. The appeal is about the failure to approve a directed verdict, right? This is a procedural appeal. And the court is saying that as it's a matter of law, not fact, the standard with which they are going to be evaluating this case is whether there was some evidence, competent and substantial, before the jury which fairly tended to sustain the verdict. If the answer to that is yes, there was, then the directed verdict was not erroneously denied and the conviction can stand. If the answer is no, there were not, then it should be overturned. So taking this standard into consideration, the court's position was that they were not required to consider the sufficiency of the evidence introduced as to all of the counts of the indictment, because there were several, and because the sentence that was imposed upon them didn't exceed what might have been lawfully imposed under any single count. So they're saying you were convicted of all of these things, but the penalty was no worse than if you'd only been convicted of one. The judgment that the court is saying, this verdict that the jury might be affirmed. So basically, even if the court found 3 of the 4 convictions were bad, because one was still acceptable, they would affirm the jury's findings because they weren't punished worse than had they been convicted of only one. So this is the point now where the court goes to a pretty thorough discussion of all of the writings and the pamphlets and the language that was used in relation to these defendants. And they found that the contents of the writing was so obviously to persuade people it addressed to turn the deaf ear to the patriotic appeals on behalf of the government of the United States that it very clearly falls within the boundaries of the Espionage Act. Now, the defendants were making an argument that their particular language, the target of their upset, was trying to prevent injury to the Russian cause, as in the communist revolution. But the court found that the content of the flyers made it very clear that these individuals were actively trying to dissuade the war effort in the United States and impugn the government and prevent people from loaning the government money for war efforts. And the court was quite clear in their view on this when they say that men must be held to have intended and to be accountable for the effects which their acts were likely to produce, even if their primary purpose and intent was to aid the cause of the Russian Revolution. The plan of action which they adopted necessarily involved, before it could be realized, defeat of the war program of the United States. As in, even though sure you're saying you care about the Russian Revolution, you done screwed the pooch when you targeted the U.S. war effort itself and were at war with Germany. So then in taking a look at the full record, the court found that the lower court, there had been a sufficient showing that the purpose of the propaganda was to excite the supreme crisis of the war, disaffection, sedition, riots, and to otherwise defeat the United States government war aims in Europe. As a result of that, they found that not only some evidence, but that there was a lot of persuasive evidence available to the jury, which tended to prove the defendants guilty as charged under the Espionage Act. Because of this, and because their evaluation was one of law, not fact, as we described previously, there was no error made when the conviction was upheld at the lower court, and so the defendants were just out of luck. Now, if you've watched a few of my videos, you know, normally speaking, I don't touch on dissents or concurring opinions. This is normally just, this is the majority finding. But in this case, we have a dissent from a justice named Holmes, which actually has some really interesting language in it. And one of the big things comes down to intention. Holmes had reviewed the content of the flyers at issue, and he then kind of compared it to the language of the statute that they were convicting these individuals under. In doing so, what he found was that the intent evidenced by the writings of the defendant didn't meet the specific intent requirement. So what he's basically saying is that to be criminal, action had to be done with intent by such curtailment to cripple or hinder the United States in the prosecution of the war. And with that intention in mind, in his reading of the statute, he said that no such intent was proved in the behavior of the defendants. He was quite clear in his view of intention itself, where he said that where you use a word exactly, here, intent, a deed isn't done with the intent to produce a result unless that result is what you're aiming for. So you have to actually intend to do the thing that you're doing and for the result to be gotten in order for strict intent to manifest itself. The reason that Holmes is very clear on this point is that he raises concerns that if you do not read intent the way he is, it creates an absurdity and would allow the government to act in a way that is absurd if you read intention too broadly. And so, looking at the writings themselves, Holmes found that rather than an intent to interfere with America's war aims as it relates to Germany and the other opposing parties, the writings were pretty clear in that they made a statement of desire to stop U.S. intervention in the ongoing Russian Revolution, which was not something that was really applicable under the Espionage Act. As a result, Holmes is basically saying they don't meet the intent requirement, they shouldn't have been convicted. And then there was also a very interesting discussion, and it brought about a term that, at least if you're in the United States, you've probably heard before, and that's the marketplace of ideas. So there's a fairly thorough discussion of the First Amendment that happens in this dissent, and one of the interesting points that he does raise is that where you want to test out different ideas, trying to figure out what is right and what's wrong, when and how and who and everything else, you have to be able to express those ideas out loud in public so that the marketplace itself, the back and forth between all of the individuals having this discussion, can win out and help decide what is correct. And anytime you put a limit on that marketplace, you prevent the cluster of people engaging in the debate from being able to express an idea. You impact and impede the marketplace's ability to weed out bad ideas, because just like your ability to express a concept to show that it's correct exists, the reverse is also true. Sometimes you say things out loud just to hear how stupid you sound and how wrong you actually are, so that other people can also help tell you. that's one of the benefits, but it's also a drawback. You get called an idiot because maybe you are. And so insofar as you have something like the Espionage Act that impedes individuals' abilities to express concerns about government action, you impede the ability of the population to form appropriate ideas, and as a result impede the ability to form proper policy positions and laws, particularly in a country like the United States or any other democratic or republic-based system where the public is the body itself that pushes forward laws through their representatives or direct action. So that is Abrams v. the United States, a long un but a good un. So I hope you enjoyed it. Reach out in the comment section down below. Let me know what you think. Do you think it's appropriate during times of conflict for the government to impose additional restrictions on speech and actions, or no? Why or why not? I'd love to hear what you have to think. But until the next time, I hope everyone is well.